I loved Dishonored. It was a great game with a great world and a great background that I'd love to see in a tabletop role-playing game. So, Dishonored 2 definitely appealed to me. I definitely wanted to see it. I definitely wanted to play it. And I've waited on it with bated breath. In the end, though, it's been something of a disappointment. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that it's a bad game. It's a great game. A very good game. It's just, it doesn't live up to the original Dishonored. Now, some of that is due to familiarity, but some of it seems to be down to effort, I guess. A lot of things that made the original Dishonored so appealing to me haven't been built on or improved on in Dishonored 2, and some things appear to have been worsened in some ways. There's just not enough that's different and new, and what has been changed takes away from what made the original Dishonored so good. And much of that is through the theme that runs through the whole game of reversal. In the original Dishonored, you are avenging an assassination. In Dishonored 2, you are setting up for an assassination. In the original Dishonored, the focus was much more on the technology and the kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, steampunk-ish, clockpunk maybe, nature of the world, with the magic very much in the background. In Dishonored 2, the magic is more in the foreground and the technology is more in the background. And so it goes with the rest of it. Now, most of the game does not take place in Dunwall, but takes place in a much more southern island. And while initially this feels different, that doesn't carry on through the whole game. You don't get the sensation that you're in a more tropical or Mediterranean climate particularly. The one alleyway in that island is much the same as an alleyway in Dunwall, unfortunately. So you don't get the feeling really that you've been transplanted to a different location. The culture, the appearance of everything is still very much the same, so you don't get that feeling of displacement that you should probably get to give it a sense of freshness. Graphically, the game has, of course, received a significant upgrade, and this definitely reflects very well in the environments and the backgrounds in which you find yourself. They're presented with much more fidelity, there seems to be more material in the rooms, you get much more of a sense that you're there. However, this seems to have acted somewhat in detriment in relation to the characters. While the styling is similar, Dishonored 2 has a much more realistic feel to it, where the original Dishonored had a somewhat cartoonish look to the characters. This, initially with the original Dishonored, was a little bit off-putting, but in the end it gave it the feeling of an adult cartoon, and that, in the end, grew on me to a huge extent. Now, that same sense is just slightly missing in Dishonored 2. The characters are slightly more realistic, and it just takes away from that kind of otherworldly feel. It's a really subtle change, but it's definitely there. It's in gameplay that I felt the biggest difference, but I'm not sure whether it's just me or whether it is something that's actually changed in the game. The original Dishonored, I played extremely stealthily and did very well doing so, and accomplished a low chaos ending. And I found the fighting quite difficult in the original Dishonored, quite deadly. So you were discouraged from doing head-on combat, and you were very much rewarded for being stealthy and going about things in a different way. In Dishonored 2, I found that the game balance had very much shifted the other way. Whether this was deliberate or not, whether it's just purely my kind of subjective recognition, I don't know, but I found that the fighting was a hell of a lot easier and the stealth was much, much more difficult. And initially I thought it was just me being rubbish, but I played through a few levels and I did what I thought were extremely stealthy playthroughs. and yet still had quite high chaos ratings. So in the end, it felt like it wasn't really worth the effort if I wanted to get through the game to be stealthy, because I wasn't being rewarded for it. I didn't feel particularly stealthy. So rather than being a stealth badass, I felt more like a combat badass, and that encouraged me to take that kind of approach towards the game. I think that's unfortunate. I would have preferred to keep the balance close to the original, where the stealth was easier and you were much more strongly rewarded for being stealthy. Whereas in this instance, where the combat was much easier and it felt like you were rewarded, and it was that much easier if you took a much more head-on combative approach, unfortunately. So that was a huge drag on the game. In terms of emotion and story, the game is also lacking. You don't feel the same sense of connection to your daughter, the new Empress, as you did in the original game, getting revenge for your lover, the old Empress. And not enough time is spent on that relationship. It's there in the intro, and then you'll split apart. I played through as Corvo rather than the Empress. I'm kind of hoping for that fatherly experience you get in The Last of Us, and so forth. Thinking, that would be something I could get from this game, but it just didn't emotionally pay off. In the original game, you got much more of a feeling of linkage to your daughter, but it was just not here in this. I mean, you're absent from her, but something could have been done through flashbacks or through lore appearing in the game to increase that sense of relationship. But it just wasn't there. There wasn't as much of an emotional payoff to what you were doing, other than the initial rush of revenge, escaping from Dunwall, where I was slaughtering all the traitorous guards and so on. I just didn't get that same emotional payoff that I got in the original. Where the original game showed you a lot about the world, Dishonored 2 tells you much more. There's much more in letters and books and so on than you're presented with in the game. In the original Dishonored, I felt that I could just kind of skip through without having to read every single scrap of lore that I came across, and could still get a feeling for the world and the people in it and the relationships between them. But it's much more telling you via these things in the game than showing you in this one. You just don't get that same sense of connection to the characters and the world that you would otherwise get, and that's another unfortunate aspect. The texts and so on, the lore should be a bonus for those who want to pore over it. It shouldn't be essential for connection to the game. In terms of enemies, you have guards of various qualities. These are pretty easy to beat. There are blood flies, which are little more than a pest, and they're kind of the replacement for the rats you had in the original game, the hordes of rats that would occasionally attack you. They're somewhat derivative of the fungus creatures in The Last of Us, in that they can infect people and bend them to their own will, and they build hives and so on. But it's quite a fun aspect of the game to go in and clear out abandoned buildings of these hives and these horrible flies, even though they never really qualify as being anything more than a pest. So that's really what you end up fighting: people and blood flies, and the occasional blood fly thrall. There are mechanical creatures, but these are nowhere near as threatening or as dangerous, in my opinion, as the tall boys were in the original, and which are conspicuously absent in Dishonored 2. They're meant to be this big, deadly new thing, but you can take them out reasonably easily in head-on combat, which goes back to what I said about combat being that much easier and you not being encouraged so much to be stealthy, because the stealth seems to be that much more difficult this time around. So if you do want to take a more combative approach, you can. There's no reason why you shouldn't. It's just, if you've had that experience with the first Dishonored, you may find that disappointing. In the beginning, it is contrived that you lose all your powers, and that's unfortunate, but that's something you find in all these kind of games. It really kind of spoils that sense of continuity for me from one game to another. I would rather have you been able to have some kind of sort of limited set of upgrades from the start, rather than having this contrived circumstance where you lose all your powers and have to build them back up. I mean, this happens with all these kind of sequel games. They don't really think long term, and unfortunately it would be good if you could build up and increase your power level and so on from one game to the next without having to be reset. Your gear can all be upgraded, gathering money and so on is done by picking pockets or looting corpses, as the case may be, and picking up valuables all around the place. So it's well worth hunting around in every corner, picking up every rune. Bone charms are slightly useful upgrades. They don't really make any huge difference, but hunting them down will tend to take you to interesting places and little side story points and things like that. Now, I know it sounds like I've been hypercritical through this whole thing, but the reason I sound hypercritical is that the first game was just so good and so different and brought a world to life in such a good way that it's hard to see how anything could have lived up to it. But this just feels unambitious. I think there should have been more effort to make Dishonored 2 as radical, as interesting, as different as the original Dishonored was. How they could have done that? I think they could have done a lot more with the world. I think they could have done a lot more with the background. I think they could have made the environment in the Southern Islands much different. They just could have done so many things that wouldn't be that difficult to do. I don't think wouldn't be that hard to implement. New textures, new designs, make the architecture different. Maybe throw in a couple of non-urban areas, or have you infiltrate a ship and deal with the people on there as an assassination. Just something to switch it up. And I personally didn't like the emphasis on the magic, though I guess that is different. I was much more interested in the technology and lore of the world. But don't get me wrong, it's still a very good, very competent stealth action game. I would still recommend it. I don't regret buying it. I think it was worth the money. So what scores would I give it? Well, style-wise, it's still very stylish and very well executed, looks beautiful, but it's just not up to speed with the original Dishonored in terms of impact and ambition and scope. So style-wise, I'd give it a 4 out of 5, but a low 4. Substance-wise, this is where it suffers. The story just doesn't quite emotionally connect, at least when you're playing Corvo. It may be different playing the other way around. It's just not ambitious, but it's perfectly workmanlike, so I'd give that a 3 out of 5. So that's a total of 7 out of 10, or 3.5 out of 5. But it's still a good game. It's definitely worth your money. I would still recommend it. It's just, if you're looking for that same hit of novelty and perfection in execution that you got from the original Dishonored, you're gonna be a bit disappointed. I'm sorry to say, but it's still a good game. I'm just a whinging bastard.